So in this video, I want to present a sketch or an outline of how I think we can approach Thelema in such a way which is alternative to the consensus Thelema framing. My purpose in this video is not to provide some kind of, authoritative definition of what Thelema means, which is somehow more pure or more original. This is usually what, people in my position doing this usually get accused of, like, oh, you're just being, a Crowleyite or something like that. The real purpose of this is not to come up with some kind of authoritative definition. The purpose of this is to see if we can take resources from Aleister Crowley, from the tradition of Thelema, and frame them or arrange them in such a way that Thelema forms a meaningful path through life, and that it does it in such a way that it avoids some of the, what I consider to be the insipid outcomes of consensus Thelema. So, my way that I'm going to do this, the way that I'm going to frame this is really strongly influenced by the work of John Vervaeke. He's a cognitive scientist who has done a lot of work on spirituality. He's got a lot of great videos on YouTube having to do with the cognitive science of wisdom and insight, and spirituality more generally. In particular, he's done a really long series called The Meaning Crisis, which I highly recommend. I've been very influenced by some of what he said there in terms of the approach that I'm going to use today. So I recommend checking that out if you're interested in this general sort of framing. The framing that he uses at one point, and then I'm going to pull in here, we're going to be talking about basically three structures. Three structures of meaning. That we're going to use to frame Thelema. And when these three structures work together, they tend to constitute a meaningful path or a meaningful set of activities, a set of activities that are encapsulated in an interpretive framework such that the activities are informed by that framework and the results of those activities are incorporated or metabolized through the framework to become meaningful. And so the three structures that he talks about are nomological structure, normative structure, and narrative structure. And so I'm going to explain in depth what these terms mean as we go along. But these are the three sorts of, these are basically the three, axes of this thing that that we're going to use to basically hopefully make Thelema intelligible as a meaningful life path. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the nomological structure. If you're not familiar with this term nomological, it comes from the Greek word nomos, which means law. In this sense, law means the lawful structure of reality. So essentially, the world that we live in is not just a jumbled confusion of things, a blooming, buzzing confusion. There are certain laws according to which things operate, including human perception and human cognition and emotion and so on and so forth. We actually encounter the term law and with it the phenomenon of nomos in Thelema. do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Law here has two meanings to it, right? In the one sense, it signifies the moral law, and we're going to return to that. That's actually normative structure, our second structure. But law, the way Crowley uses it, also tends to refer to nomological structure. Because to live in accordance with one's will is to live in accordance with nature, as it is expressed in and through you, to not be at odds with what is natural to you. So already in this central idea of Thelema, we have reference to the idea of the nomological structure of reality. And so then the question becomes, well, okay, what exactly is this nature that he's referring to? Is he referring to like, particle physics? Is he referring to anthropology? Well, yes and no. Primarily what he has in mind here when he talks about nomos or law as the law of nature, what he primarily has in mind is the picture of nature which is revealed by the book of the law. If you look at the introduction that Crowley wrote to the book of the law, which you can look at on my Mouth of the Beast website, if you read that introduction early on in it, he says, this book explains the universe. The picture of the universe, the account of the universe, which is relevant to do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, is not just, any old value neutral account of the universe. It is the picture of the universe which we find in the book of the law. That's the basis of the nomological structure of Thelema. So, sometimes you'll see Crowley say things like, truth is relative to each individual. Values are relative to each individual. And what that means is that each person has their own unique perspective on the cosmos. But each person is also a star, meaning a soul, that is situated in a universe which is basically defined by Nuit and Hadid. So yes, each person has their own unique angle or perspective on the universe. For example, when I'm looking out the window over here, I can see that, there's a street, and then in between me and the street, there's a car parked. And because of how I'm situated with regard to, that car and that street, I'm only seeing certain aspects of that street, certain objects are concealed from me. But if somebody were standing across the street, they would see a completely different aspect of it. We each have our own perspective. We're each seeing different faces of reality, but we are all part of the same overarching structure or nomological structure of reality. I may, in principle, never gain, first-person access to that other person's experience of things. Their truth is going to be, in a certain sense, always unknown or opaque to me. But that doesn't change the fact that we are still causally interrelated with one another according to this nomological framework. So, yes, truth is relative in Thelema, but that doesn't mean that there is no truth at all. Or there is a structure which is binding all of us together, which we have to be cognizant of if we are going to be able to put truth to use, or if we're going to be able to realize truth. So that's the point of knowing the nomological structure. Now I'm going to give a very brief overview of the nomological structure. I've written a lot about this on my blog. If you look in particular at my dualism and monism series, I've written a lot about this there, and I've just written about it all over my blog. This is the really abbreviated version, okay? So, according to the Book of the Law, the universe is made up of two elements. There's Nuit, and there's Hadid. Nuit is the sum total of all possibilities, all things that could be. Anything that you experience or could experience is nuit. The lamp that I see across the room is nuit. When I look out into the heavens, that's nuit. When I feel, sensation on my skin, that's nuit. When I reflect upon thoughts and feelings inside my head, that's also nuit. When I take my consciousness and I turn it back on itself and observe my own mental states and engage in insight and reflection, all of that's coming up is nuit, because that's all objects of perception. On the other hand, you have hadith. Hadith is the observer or the point of view. Hadith is never the object, but only ever the subject. So whenever hadith tries to turn around and reflect upon itself, what it actually catches is this, nuit, okay? So these are basically the two elements of the universe. I mean, you could look at them as two elements of the universe or two elements of experience, which in Thelema are, they're roughly the same thing. Reality is relative to what we can experience. You can think of these as the a priori conditions of experience if you're more philosophically inclined. So we basically have subject and object. However, subject and object derive from a more fundamental reality, which Crowley calls the Kabbalistic zero. This is an idea that he gets from Hebrew Kabbalah. It's basically equivalent with Ein or Ein Sof. This is the ground from which both Nuit and Hadith are derived from. He also calls this nothingness extended in no categories. He wrote an essay on this called Bereshith. But you find this idea of nothingness as the ground of things all over the place in Crowley. It's in the Book of Lies. It's in Magic and Theory and Practice. It's in the commentaries. It's in Magic Without Tears. This idea was always very, very important to him. Now, the fact that the a priori conditions of experience, or these elements of the cosmology, the fact that they can be derived from a single principle or a primordial ground, means that the nomological structure is a form of monism. That's basically what monism means, is that everything derives from a single principle rather than from many principles. And because we are able to derive it, Crowley actually does a mathematical derivation of this. I mean, there are different kinds of derivations given this in the Kabbalistic tradition. Crowley's is mathematical. That makes this a form of derivation monism, as I've called it, for the simple reason that you're deriving these things logically from this. So, Nuit and Hadith combine to form a star. The star is the solar essence of each individual. The way that this works is that Hadith is a point particle. So there are many Hadiths basically all over the place. And it is a particular path of a particular Hadith through Nuit that creates the star, which is also equated with Ra Horkuit. This is also Kether on the Tree of Life. And so this breaks out into your familiar Tree of Life here. And remember, the Tree of Life is a map of the soul as much as it is a map of experiential and magical reality. One thing to note here, and there's a lot more to say about this. For instance, this part here is what Crowley calls the cobs, whereas this part here he calls the coup, or the magical garment. This is the ruach here, out to about here. Whoops, here. And then you've got the nefesh here, which is basically sentience. There's a lot more to say about this. Obviously, you can read more about it on my blog. I go into a lot more depth on it. One thing to point out here about this is that there is no real distinction between basically everything to the right of this line and everything to the left of this line. There's no real distinction. This is a technical distinction from scholastic philosophy. This is a modal distinction. Basically, each consciousness is a mode of the absolute of this zero, which you could think of as God. And the way that mode is expressed is as the will. This is where the will is basically originating from. I mean, arguably, the word, okay, so the word of the will is here, right? And then the word is heard over here at Bina. This gets very complicated, but basically, the way that the absolute is manifesting out of this primordial ground through your being, through your consciousness, is what your will is. There's a lot more to say about this, but let's just leave it there. What I want to point out to you is that since there's no real distinction between these two things, there's in a sense a certain identity between them. More specifically, this first principle, zero, it's not like something that's like existing off somewhere in some other realm. I mean, it can't. It's actually nothing. The zero is actually the principle of the unification of the entirety of manifest reality. That's why it's not separate. So the way in which reality shows up as a whole, that is an expression of the zero. So for this reason, Crowley says 0 equals 2, right? Because everything down here, since it's a combination of Nuit and Hadith, is an expression of duality, of the +1 and the -1. And because these are perfectly balanced with each other, he represents this also by the balance, or Libra. This is also Lamed, terrible Lamed, I know. This is Aleph, and so you have A and L, the letters of the Book of the Law. Again, super, complicated, deep subject that we could get into, but that's the overview of the nomological structure of Thelema. It's important it's important for so many reasons. The fact that the universe is a balanced whole and that the realization of the first principle is a realization of balance means that you experience the first principle through balanced acts of magic. All of Crowley's magic is about balance, okay? It's all about basically trying to find your way up this middle pillar. That's a huge part of it. The fact that that the system results in a kind of nullity or a nullification of the sense of separateness is built into this. The fact that this is the point that I really kind of wanted to drive home is that the will emerges from this. The will is not something that's just freestanding. What we tend to think of as free will is more down here in the Ruach. Okay, that's not the true will. The true will is something which is more primordial. It's something more dark. It's more unknown. It's something that we have to come to terms with. It's not something that we get to choose one way or the other. The whole point of this structure down here is basically to be in subservience to this port up here. So it's involved in complicated ways. But that is basically the nomological structure of Thelema. So let's take a look now at the normative structure. And if you want to hear about any, if you want me to do a deep dive on any particular aspect of this, just let me know. Let's consider now the normative structure. So norms have to do more with evaluation and ethics. Really norms have to do with what's worth pursuing. What's good in life? Now, the sort of, the typical response to this, right, is that what you will is what's worth pursuing. It's relative to each individual. Each person has their own good, their own purpose, which they're here to pursue, and that's perfectly correct. That's also correct to some extent, even if you're not a Thelemite. I mean, that's sort of a generally recognized principle throughout history. The real question is, how do you determine what you ought to do or what you ought to pursue? Is there some particular object that you have to pursue? Maybe it's the cultivation of certain virtues. You have deontological ethics, which says, no, it's not an object. It's more like a principle or a form that your action or your moral law has to take. And then you've also got utilitarian ethics, which is more like the greatest good for the greatest number. It's a little hard to situate Crowley in these. Crowley is closer to this, I would say. Not this. Especially if you're in OTO, Thelemic ethics comes out very much like this. That's a discussion for another time. I want to deal with this at a much higher, more basic level. In terms of the question of value, yes, it is a question of doing your will, but we're also given some more information about it in the Book of the Law, because in the Book of the Law, we also read but to love me is better than all things. The me here, of course, is nuit. Now, what does that mean? Well, nuit is infinite space. Nuit is the sum total of all possibilities. Anything that could be for you, that's nuit. Anything that is, that was, that could be. To love nuit, in the fullest sense of the term, would be a completely open-hearted approach to reality, a kind of radical acceptance of things. Pure will unassuaged of purpose, delivered from the lust of result, is every way perfect. This is really the condition which has been attained by the Magister Template. The master of the temple has crossed the abyss. They no longer make any difference between one thing and another. They have undermined the cause of sorrow. And so they have essentially come to an acceptance of reality. Crowley also talks about this as indifference to circumstance. Which is very similar to the ancient Greek concept of ataraxia, which was the outcome of Stoic or Epicurean practice, a kind of peaceful indifference or acceptance of reality. Now, that's fine for the Magister Template. The problem is, how do we start to think about this in terms of, our experience? How do we translate that into terms that we can understand and that we can start pursuing? We can't just jump from where we are, across the abyss to just start accepting everything. How do we make that happen? Part of the problem here is that, well, it's not really a problem so much. We can use this as a guide. Nuit is infinite space. Infinite space, okay, so imagine that you're just simply floating out in space with very little sense of your body. You're not near any planets or any stars. You don't really have any sense of orientation because there's really no structure there. So, when she says, but to love me is better than all things, the way that Crowley interprets that is that you should be Hadit, and you should love Nuit. You can't adore Hadit. You can only adore Nuit. You have to be Hadit and adore her. Hadit is just simply a point particle, okay? So imagine you're just simply a point particle floating out in space, or you're in some kind of sensory deprivation thing. There's really no sense of which way to go. Like you could be going in a certain direction, but we know that inertial motion is identical in every way to simply standing still, right? Those, like, motion and stillness are completely identical. We, both in Thelema and in, relativity. So in order to have any sense of a direction or anything to pursue in life, you have to have more than just simply unstructured space. You need to have some kind of directionality. You have to be able to have up and down. You need to be able to have left and right. You need to be able to have forward and backward. Once you have that, you can start to pursue something. Then the idea of moving from point A to point B to approach something in a loving way starts to make sense. But in order to begin to have this, you need to have a physical body. Okay? Once you have hands, then you've got, left hand, right hand. Once you have a chest and a back, you have forwards and backwards. You have up and down. Once you have that, then you can start to do magic, right? You need directions in order to do magic. So now your elemental directions can start to come in. Because remember, okay, this love here, love in this sense for Crowley always means magic. Well, not always, that's a strong statement, but I should say magic is love. Magic is will. Magic is love under will, is basically what he says. So to go toward Nuit requires doing magic. Magic requires directionality, places to put the elements. It requires the body. When we do magical ritual, right, the directions and the elements are always involved somehow in order to do that. So we get the body out of that. Now we're still missing something here, because we have things that are that are this way, that way. Arguably, we also have internal and out, but we still don't really have anything to resist us. We don't have anything. You need traction and friction and resistance in order to go, right? A bird flying through a strong wind might imagine to itself, hey, it'd be so much easier to fly if I didn't have all of this air around me, right? But that's not how it works. You need resistance in order to have motion, and you need gravity in order to tell up from down. So that means that we also need the earth. Now the earth is important, but before I get into that, what I want to point out here is that, if there were no body in the way, if there were no star, if there were no personality, you would simply have the union of Nuit and Hadit, which we know just simply equals 0. So it would actually be nothing. So in order for Hadit to have the experience of the love of Nuit, this has to be broken up. And so really that is, in a certain sense, the reason for incarnation, because this union can't really be appreciated or enjoyed unless you have the body in here, and unless you have earth, and unless you have these forms of resistance. See, this is really important because, from a spiritual perspective, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that, oh, it would just be so much easier and so much better if my body weren't in the way. Then I would have this, perfect union with perfect divine reality. My senses wouldn't be acting as these weird distorters and filters of things. And that's not the perspective of magic. That's not really a magical perspective. A magical perspective would say that the body is actually not in the way. The body is actually a perfect tool of the gods. It's perfectly suited to a divine use. The problem is that we don't know how to properly use the body. And so the effect of that is that the body ends up using us. We're subject to passions, we're subject to distortions and delusions and so on and so forth. And so really the practice of magic is really ultimately a practice of establishing that proper relationship with the body in order to get this flowing, but to get it flowing in a self-conscious, self-realized way, which is essentially what wisdom is, we might say. Okay. Back to the earth, though. So earth shows up in two ways in Thelema. Okay. On the one hand, you have Malkuth, right, who is also the daughter. This is also Malka, and it's associated with He final of Tetragrammaton. Okay. It's a little bit technical, but hang in there. On the other hand, we also know that Earth is Babylon, the mother of us all. The mother, associated with Binah, and associated with He. The Thelemic path of initiation is to set the daughter on the throne of the mother. But what exactly does that mean? So, one way to think about this is that to be in Malkuth is to be in an uninitiated state. It's to experience the body, as I said before. We're not using the body and the senses, properly in order to affect this union of Nuit and Hadit with the effect that the body is using us. And so in a certain sense, we're in a state of turmoil or uneasiness or suffering. I think at one point Crowley describes that the uninitiated person as, crawling irritably upon the face of the earth for a short span. Not a great condition. So we can think of this also as samsara, right, from the Buddhist tradition. Now this state of Binah, this is also associated with what I was talking about before, the Magister Templi, who has overcome sorrow, who has basically moved to this place of complete acceptance. And so you can think of this in a certain sense as Nibbana in the Buddhist tradition. And so to set the daughter on the throne of the mother is in a certain sense to transcend this state of samsara into Nibbana, except that it's not quite that simple because we're actually only dealing here with one earth. We're not actually dealing with two completely distinct realities here. So really what this is about is the equation of He final with the first He of the mother. In other words, the equation of samsara with Nibbana. It's much more of like a Mahayana Buddhist system of attainment. So that's the way in which that's essentially the way in which the highest value, the love of Nuit, is achieved in Thelema. We're not just simply in structureless infinite space. We have bodies that gives us directionality, that gives Hadit the sense of going towards something. And when we affect the proper reorientation toward our bodies, toward our minds, toward reality by means of a series of turning points, maybe like certain peak experiences, but also baseline shifts in perspective, various openings. We experience a kind of transcendence, a self-transcendence past the limits of the ego. That doesn't mean that we rocket off the planet. It means that we come to see Earth under a completely different aspect. So it's really a transformation of the significance of our current state rather than an escape from that current state, as in, for example, Buddhism or Gnosticism, let's say. Now, I mentioned this bit about turning points. The turning points are very important because this brings us into our third structure, which is narrative structure. Going through turning points, starting at A, heading on your way to B, getting knocked off track and ending up at C, and then ending up at D, and then E, and so forth. This is the stuff that narrative is made of. We're all here on a journey, on a quest. Now, before, when we were talking about the normative structure, we're really talking about different things that we might aim for in life. And one way to think about the sort of the normative structure that we exist in at any moment is to just ask, like, why am I doing something? So for example, why am I making this video right now? Well, the reason that I'm making this video right now is because I want to communicate an alternative framework for Thelema in terms of these three structures. Well, why do I want to communicate those three structures? Well, because I think that if people understand this, they might come to a deeper appreciation of Thelema and a deeper appreciation of their own lives. Well, why do I want people to have a deeper appreciation of their own lives and of Thelema? Well, because I know what the experience of meaninglessness is like, what it's like to feel like life has no direction or no purpose, and the pain of that. And I would like to help alleviate human beings of that feeling through an experience of awe and curiosity and wonder and so forth. Why do you want to do that? And so you go outward in these sort of vaster and vaster and vaster shells. And when you continue to go out that way, you don't end up at some kind of abstract principle. Like, there's no way you're going to do that and be like, oh, well, because 0 equals 2, that's why I want to do that. Or because, because of the will, I mean, this is just a circular answer to it. I want, I feel compelled to pursue this because I feel compelled to pursue this. It's not really much of an answer. It's very abstract. It's very, it's intellectual. Really what happens when our minds go outward like that, often what happens is that in the case of an individual, it's really common that the person, met somebody when they were younger, they had a role model, or they had some particular kind of encounter with, hostility or destruction or evil or something, and their mind formed sort of like a negative image of that, like a sort of negative personality. And it's like, I don't want to be like this person, I want to be like this other sort of idealized version. In other words, when we think about what's good, when we think about what's pursuing, it's unavoidable that we think about personalities or individuals or characters, ideal embodiments of the good. Not just the good itself in a kind of propositional sense, because like propositions don't inherently have meaning for us. You can recognize that a proposition is true without really feeling compelled to live it out. Really, it's the way that a proposition or an idea is embodied in a certain kind of attitude. And, at a cultural level, really what that comes down to is that we have certain heroes or we have certain godlike figures. And all cultures have these, Gilgamesh, Heracles, Buddha fighting off the armies of Mara to achieve enlightenment. Odin. Of course, obviously, a huge one is Christ. Christ is an overwhelming hero figure in the West. Why is Christ a hero figure? Well, Christ defeats death, for one thing. That's pretty badass. He performs some miracles in life and, has some really nice teachings that we appreciate now. that's not necessarily what makes Christ so compelling. I mean, Socrates taught cool things too. And, Socrates is also a role model, but there was always something really compelling about Jesus. And I think it's because Jesus Christ as a figure really kind of connected in a very compelling way, the highest and the lowest. So for one thing, Christ is supposed to be the flesh and body embodiment of God, God coming out of heaven and, giving his only son. But, he also faces suffering. He carries the cross. He's tortured. He dies horribly. He descends into hell. He not only descends into hell and comes back, but while he's down there, he frees all of the souls that are trapped in hell and, brings them back with him. And, on top of it, forgives all sins and grants, immortal life to everyone who is and ever will be and whoever was. It's like, okay, that's an interesting story, certainly. And, you could laugh it off and, dismiss Christianity, but you can't deny that it's obviously it's been a really compelling story for humanity. So who is this Christ-like figure in the context of Thelema? Well, okay, let's back up for a second. Why do we need a figure like that? You might think, isn't it just good enough that we have these abstract principles like the will or love or, the love of Nuit, or let's just do magic and not worry about this other stuff or who I should be like? It's because by and large, the human brain seems to relate to abstract ideas better when they're embodied. Like mythological figures, heroes, God men or God people, whatever you want to call it, are very convenient shorthands for things that we want to embody in ourselves and things we want to realize. So obviously, you probably know where I'm going to go with this. That figure in Thelema is Horus. Horus is the Christ-like figure in Thelema. So when Nuit and Hadit combine, they don't just combine into, any old thing. They combine into this Rahor Kuit character. Which is not to say that it's ideal for you to start, pecking out the eyes of your enemies and so on and so forth. Maybe it is. I don't know. Horus is a larger, more complex figure than simply Rahor Kuit, because Horus is also Horpakra, the crowned and conquering child. Horus is sort of like a super Christ, like especially if you read Liber Tzadi. Liber Tzadi really describes Horus in this kind of like super savior mode as like swooping down upon the black earth and turning it green, right? Remember what I said before about He final being seen as He, okay? That's the greening of the earth. Horus is here to do more than just simply liberate souls on earth. Horus is here to actually show each and every person how under their own power they can, ascend and cross the abyss themselves and basically become gods. Essentially, that goes even for, Christ doesn't do that. Tzadi also talks about how my adepts stand tall with their heads in heaven and their feet in hell. I forget what the exact wording is, but basically clearly serving this Christ-like function, which is to unite heaven and earth. In Christianity, this is effected through a kind of self-sacrifice. This is also done vicariously, so Christ basically through his own sacrifice affects this union of heaven and earth. That's not the Thelemic teaching, obviously. Self-sacrifice in that sense is not required. And because remember, you're not actually like you're sacrificing a certain meaning or a certain intention of this to get to here. That's essentially what the sacrifice in the Gnostic Mass is. Because remember, in the Gnostic Mass, the priest serves the role of Christ in that. He's the Agnus Dei, or the Lamb of God, who is breaking his body and shedding his blood for the resolution of sin. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. this is something that's carried out under your own power. So this is actually not just transcendence, this is self-transcendence. And so Horus is the model to be emulated in Thelema. It is the figure that we are ultimately to become. Remember, in the AA rituals of initiation, it's Horus who's the initiator, as opposed to Osiris, Asar in the Golden Dawn initiation. So, I mean, this operates at many different levels. So those are our three structures that we've got. So again, to recap, the three structures of Thelema. We had the nomological structure. This is basically Nuit and Hadit, which are, coming out of the Kabbalistic zero, uniting in myriad ways to create all of these stars or souls, and creating the tree of life, and basically creating a system of holistic monism, which is significant at many different levels in Thelema: the epistemology, the ethics, the soteriology. A lot of it you can see coming out of this nomological structure. And of course, the idea of the will is embedded in here as well. The nomological structure tells you what the will is. So let me just point out one thing here. The way in Thelema, this is actually a really important point. There's a lot of equivocation around this term, right? This term could mean something like your free will, your freedom of choice. It can mean something like your HGA or the voice of God. It could be something like your nature. It could be something like, I don't know. There's all sorts of things that this could be. The problem with having this much equivocation around a central term is that if you're not tracking the meaning of this term through your different actions, the likelihood that you're going to deceive yourself, basically that you're going to bullshit yourself, is very high when you do that. Okay? You can't have that much equivocation around a term. So the way that the nomological structure helps is by really helping us contextualize. Contextualize and nail down this term. You might think to yourself, well, who are you to tell me what my will is? It's not what your will is, it's what will in general is. You have to know what that category means. Otherwise, as you're going through different transitions of things, right? You want to know that you're actually heading toward the goal over here. If one of your key terms that you're trying to use to track your way through life has that much wiggle room around it, you're just gonna bullshit yourself. I mean, it's trivially easy to do that. So that's probably the best reason to study some of this and get a good enough grasp of it. We looked at the normative structure, which is really has to do with value and the pursuit of value and evaluation. We looked at the way in which we have to contextualize infinite space as the body on the earth, and how important that setup is to the practice of magic, which is love under will. Okay. And finally, we looked at the narrative structure, which is Horus. There are other figures in Thelema that figure really prominently as well, especially in the context of OTO. You've got Baphomet. There's also Beast and Babylon conjoined. The Sphinx. These in particular are about balance. Remember how important I said balance was to the nomological structure? So Sphinx is like a concrete visualization, a flesh and blood thing, so to speak, that exemplifies what balance is, right? So instead of thinking about balance abstractly, like, oh, I could have a little heroin and then a little coke to balance things out. It's not abstract. It's more like, you can turn it into a ritual, right? That's what the Sphinx is about. Same thing with, Beast in Babylon is basically the Thelemic version of the Sphinx. Baphomet, again, Christ-like figure uniting heaven and earth, male and female, man and animal, so on and so forth. And Horus as an even larger, all-encompassing figure. So that's basically the structure that I'm working with here. There might be other ways to do this. I mean, maybe as you were listening to this, you were thinking, oh, he could have said, X, Y, or Z, or done it differently this way, and so on and so forth. It's a framework that allows a certain level of improvisation. And so this is sort of my, off the cuff improvisation that I've come up with in like the last week after watching some of John Vervaeke's videos, and I thought it was kind of interesting and wanted to share it with you guys. Let me know what you think of it. Let me know if it's cool. Let me know if you think it sucks. I'm sure I'll definitely hear about that. Or, if you have different directions that you think it might go. If you want me to go into depth on any of these, let me know. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you'd like to hear more of, or like some more information on. Make sure you click like on the video if you like it. That helps keep our videos up front and in the algorithm. And I know I have not made so many videos lately, but I'm gonna try to get back into the swing of it. If you subscribe, there might be some more videos soon, especially if you guys show some interest and want to see more. So, thank you for your patience and indulging me throughout this video, and hope to talk to you soon. Love is the law, love under will.